Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Bohigian for giving me the possibility, the wonderful possibility to talk here this afternoon. And also thank you all for coming and supporting me from the audience. And I also hope that what we can talk about this afternoon will give you the incentive to go to the rare book section in the Becker Library and visit some of our treasures there. But we don't even know exactly how to spell his name. It is truly frustrating when we have so little proven biographical data of an important historical figure that nearly every sentence about him has the words probably or possibly or most likely in it. Almost everything seems to be questionable. This is the case with Georg Bartisch, who by medical historians was equally called the father of modern ophthalmology, simply a genius and an experienced eye doctor, as well as a mere compiler of information very involved in the superstitions of his day. The letter E at the end of his first name, Georg, seems to be the smallest problem, and it is due to the fact that in his publications he used both ways of the spelling. This kind of inconsistency was frequent in 16th century orthography. But in other aspects as well, we know only a few facts about Bartisch the person and the professional. Among other things, we have no secure information about his date of death either. So, what would be the way to form an objective opinion, draw a realistic portrait of Georg Bartisch? The attempt promises to be more successful if we concentrate on his most comprehensive work as evidence, a book printed in 1583. Verba volant, scripta manent, says the ancient Latin proverb. Spoken words fly away, writing remains. Or, as one of his biographers phrased it, Bartisch's life is found in his book. Therefore, the center of this lecture today is this 432-year-old testimony, Bartisch's main work, commonly called by its subtitle Augendienst, German for the service of the eye. The Augendienst is well known in the literature of ophthalmic history, and the resources usually discuss it with emphasis on its medical content. In this analysis, I intend to concentrate on its illustrations to provide a pictorial exegesis elaborating on some social and historical aspects. Bartisch himself drew attention to the importance of the images in his book, as he often added to the descriptions a phrase, as this next representative figure clearly shows. He naturally referred to the expressiveness of the image in relation to the disease or cure it depicted. I, in addition, would like to encourage the scrutinizer of this volume, in this case, you all, to pay attention to the marginal issues as well, the clothing of the patients and the eye surgeon, the interior of rooms, the decoration of the surgical instruments, and the like. This way, one can encounter a fuller picture of the late 16th century life, or at least a segment of it, while turning pages in this age-old volume. Before starting to turn digital pages, first let me present some of the little information that is known about the author's life. Georg Bartisch was thought to have been born in 1535 in Königsbrück, a small town near Dresden, Germany. We can deduce his year of birth from the portrait in the Augendienst, which pictures him at the age of 48 and is dated 1583. Coming from a humble background, Bartisch was not able to attend a university or medical school and turned to surgery. In the 16th century, surgery had a very different status among medical disciplines than in the modern era. Surgeons learned by apprenticeship, practiced often in barber shops or in open marketplaces, and were frequently identified as barber surgeons. In most early modern pictorial representations, surgeons are even dressed differently from physicians. A surgeon usually wears a short coat, as opposed to the physician's long academic garb. Physicians were educated at universities, at medical schools, had diplomas proving their knowledge, whereas surgeons measured their familiarity with the profession by experience. Bartisch, as well, refers to this in the foreword of the Augendienst, saying, "In each craft which you are devoted to, practice the best master." Furthermore, he emphasizes his 36 years of experience in the oculist occupation, supporting his claim with testimonials about his work, describing 107 successful cures throughout 26 folio pages. Each testimonial names the place and the time where and when the case took place, thus indicating that Bartisch practiced in Saxony, Silesia, and Bohemia during the second half of the 16th century. An interesting feature of the text is that Bartisch refers to himself consistently as oculist and stonecutter, by two kinds of surgical activities that frequently were performed by the same practitioner. In Bartisch's case, this fact is also represented by his other extant work, Kunstbuch, which discusses bladder stones. After settling in Dresden in 1588, Bartisch became the oculist of the German elector Lord Augustus, Duke of Saxony, to whom he dedicated the Augendienst. However, he even earlier must have reached higher social and financial status than a barber surgeon. One sign of this is the richly decorative attire he wears in the portrait, and the other, the fact that he was able to publish this profusely illustrated and very extensive and therefore very expensive book already in 1583. During the 1590s, Bartisch continued his work as an itinerant surgeon. His practice included some remarkable cures and earned him the patronage of high authorities, such as the widowed Queen of Denmark and even Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor. He was known as skilled in couching cataracts, in surgical procedures of styes, lacrimal fistulas, and operating on ocular injuries, and had become renowned as the first to practice surgical extirpation of the globe for cancer of the eye. After many years of traveling, in the year of 1600, Bartisch made an attempt to settle in Vienna. However, since he had no citizenship issued in this city, he was not allowed to take the required medical examination to be able to practice. The regulations were strict in order to protect the interest of the local surgeons and guard the public from the incompetent. Bartysz was forced to depart, and circa 6 years later, he died at the age of about 66. And now, let's turn to his book, The Augendienst. After the Dresden first edition of 1583, a second edition appeared in 1584 in Frankfurt, followed by a third edition printed in Nuremberg in 1686. This third edition was illustrated with copper engravings, different from the first and second editions that contain woodcuts. These woodcuts, as you will see, are remarkably detailed and originally were printed in black and white. Nonetheless, in some copies of the 1583 Augendienst, like in the one whose images I am showing you today, the illustrations were hand-colored some time after the printing. So these images that you see in color today are from one of the 4 known colored copies that belongs to Émile Javal at the French Ophthalmological Society. In the Augendienst, Bartysz repeatedly emphasizes the fact that even though he had not attended university, he was not just a lesser educated surgeon, but a person who can be acclaimed by erudition. He chose a Greek word for the beginning of the title of his book, ophthalmodouleia, which is the root of the word ophthalmology. And in the foreword, he uses quotations from Homer, Ovid, and Saint Basilius, among other classics. Furthermore, he claims that he also values highly the medical classics, such as Hippocrates and Celsus, and emphasizes the importance of knowledge acquired by traveling as well. Later in the text, he inserts Greek, Latin, and Arabic terms. All this created an ambivalent opinion in the historiography of the Augendienst, when certain historians claimed that these high cultural segments of the Bartysz text were inserted by another author. In addition to the ancient classical authors, another frequently cited resource in the Augendienst is the Bible. As many 16th century scientific writings, this book as well was written reflecting a worldview with a strong religious framework. The reason for eye diseases or blindness was often determined as God's punishment for sins, and at the same time, eye cures were therefore a beautiful gift from God. On the other hand, Bartysz argues against the laying of the hands as a cure for any kind of ailment. The religious approach is intertwined with a strong moral theme, which is a general feature all through the book, but especially discussed in the first part following the anatomical illustrations of the human head and eye, which you will be able to see in the reading room after the talk. There are examples for the moral commitment already in the introduction. Bartysz here writes about dispensing medications that cost him more than he could charge, and about following his patients from the beginning of the disease to its end, not like the itinerant surgeons who cut into the patients and then leave him in the care of a peasant or a cobbler. The anatomical chapter contains the 2 most interesting illustrations in the volume. According to Julius Hirschberg, Sona Rosa Bernstein, and Paul Tower. These illustrations are based on or even copied from Andreas Vesalius's famous work, The Fabrica. I would argue, however, that the Bartish images in their execution and even conceptually are original and show little relation to the Vesalian figures. The main characteristic of the Bartish anatomical illustrations is that they are movable images containing several superimposed layers representing the head and the eye. These layers are not realistic cross-sections of the organs, but didactical depictions showing various parts that are not necessarily on the same physical level in the real brain and eye. In Vesalius's head illustrations, on the other hand, we see single, more realistic cross-sections. The following part of the book is about what a proper oculist and stonecutter should be. According to Bartish, he should be God-fearing, learned and well-informed, sensible, should have light fingers, and thus should be able to play musical instruments, should not be boozy, and should not promise more to the patient than what he can do. A lot to live up to, Dr. Oculists. The main content of the Augendienst, the description of the eye diseases and their cures, starts in the second part with the discussion of congenital anomalies, including strabismus. In addition to purges and medications, Bartish recommends various head caps, especially for children. This one is made of canvas with padding for the nose and directs the child's eye to the desired direction. Probably didn't help. Among the purges, Bartish describes a wafer made of flour, sugar, fennel, cloves, saffron, and other spices, baked with the aid of this wafer iron, decorated by his name and crest. Part 3 of the book discusses the weaknesses of vision and has been considered one of the least acceptable chapters according to modern scientific interpretation. The reason is that Bartish heavily argues against the use of eyeglasses. And I quote, "One finds people who have become accustomed to spectacles and think it is very good for their vision, even in their youth. They think this way they keep their vision fresh. But it is more beneficial to do without spectacles. One sees better if there is nothing in front of his eyes than with something being there, however thin or clear. It is much better for a person to preserve 2 eyes than to have 4. The following 2 chapters contain descriptions of various kinds of cataract and the cataract operation. The causes of cataract, according to Bartish, sins, vapors from the stomach, bad food, too much wine, or injuries, reflect his religious and moral approach, as well as other early modern medical thoughts, and only a few realistic ideas. His recommendations about the use of surgical instruments are more practical and acceptable for a modern-day approach, as he suggests that the cataract needle should be always clean and made with care. Note the fine ornamental decoration on the handles of the instruments. It's really nice. An important evergreen notion by Bartish is that before doing anything else, it is most important for an eye surgeon to wash his hands. He also discusses the complications of cataract surgery in a more rational way, as he lists bleeding, inflammation, severe pain, and reappearance of the disease. Part 7 discusses eye secretions discharged by threads made of hair, while the application of medicines to the eyes is detailed in Part 8. Here, Bartish prescribes again that the surgeon who wants to apply medication should first wash hands. Then, one hand opens the eye of the patient, the other grabs a sponge which has been soaked in the medication, and then presses the sponge to the medication to drip in the eye. Another way of administering medicine to the eye is vapor bath, as is shown in the following figure. Tumors of the eyelid are discussed in the 9th chapter, while in the 10th, Bartish particularizes defects of the hair around the eyes, followed by another section on eye injuries. This latter chapter attracted the interest of later practitioners of ophthalmic surgery and contributed to the fact that Bartish is still considered a significant figure of the field. One of these momentous issues is the handling of foreign bodies in the eye. Bartish irrigates them out of the conjunctiva, which is regarded by Julius Hirschberg, renowned ophthalmic historian, as not a bad procedure. Necessarily, Bartish also uses instruments to remove foreign bodies from the eye. The other and most well-known surgical procedure in the Augendienst is the removal of the severely protruding cancerous eye, which, according to Bartish, may occur after unsuccessful cataract operation. This modus operandi, called the Bartish method, was invented by Bartish, as according to the literature of ophthalmic surgery, he applied it first to this major problem. These are the special instruments he devised for the operation. A famous illustration appears for the second time in the volume in this same chapter. In lieu of anesthesia, surgeons had to come up with imaginative ideas to make sure that the patient stayed still during operations. I think they also use alcohol. From the socio-historical point of view, the most intriguing section of the Augendienst is Part 13, about lesions and defects that happen to people through sorcery, witches, demons, and works of the devil. The existence of the devil is confirmed in Bartish's opinion by unbelievably awful or strange diseases, one pictured here in this illustration. In this case, he says, things are growing out of the eye that are no different in appearance than a normal pear or apple. Who can or may say that this is supposed to be natural and not from witchcraft? Exclaims Bartish in the legend under the image. His strong belief suggests cures accordingly, determined by the unrealistic causations. He recommends the use of charms and amulets for healing, operations performed under specifically chosen signs of the zodiac, as well as bloodletting and cupping. 19th and 20th century historiography of medicine scrutinized these features of Bartysz's medical theory and practice as superstition. Whole scholarly articles have been written about the superstitious nonsense in the Augendienst. Curiously, the word superstition originally meant standing over something in amazement and awe, thus without understanding. It basically meant irrational thoughts and fears. But what to us may appear non-rational was central to the consciousness of early modern Europe, writes Andrew Weir in an excellent recent historical essay. By hindsight, it is tempting to easily categorize these ideas as superstition. However, I argue that we would describe and understand them better by using terms like supernatural explanations and paranormal concepts related to systems that at the time made sense. In that age, magic, astrology, witchcraft, and medicine, as well as alchemy, were coexistent and often hardly divisible from each other. Contemporaries of Bartysz, among them Ambroise Paré, Richard Bannister, Hieronymus Brunschwig, and Paracelsus, all practiced these arts, truly representing the worldview of the 16th century. Does this coexistence disappear following the mind-boggling sweep of the scientific revolution in the next century? Do observation, empiricism, and experimentation take over the place of the supernatural and the paranormal in the science of medicine in the new Baroque age? We would certainly like to say yes. But Georg Bartysz's book happens to be one that sets an example for the contrary when we look at its earlier mentioned third edition, which was published in 1686. Exactly 103 years had passed since the first edition of the Augendienst. During this time, science had changed immensely, and almost every branch of it had been reformed. Francis Bacon postulated that the way to arrive to truth is through inductive reasoning and not only studying authoritative texts. Kepler established the laws of planetary motion, and with Galileo's contributions and Newton's dynamic synthesis, a new epoch had begun in physics. In chemistry, Robert Boyle proposed the experimental method and thus transformed alchemy into scientific chemistry. In medicine, a new third generation followed Andreas Vesalius's revolution in anatomy. Discoveries and first scientific descriptions saw the light in the books of Gabriele Fallopio about the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, by Franciscus ab Aquapendente about valves in the veins, and finally by William Harvey, who first demonstrated the circulation of the blood, pioneering modern physiology. Microscopic anatomist Marcello Malpighi described the delicate system of capillaries. Giovanni Battista Morgagni established modern pathology, and Thomas Willis provided the most complete and accurate account on the nervous system. This phenomenal advancement of 17th century medicine would genuinely imply that the late 1686 edition of the Augendienst must incorporate many of the progressive changes that took place between the first and the third edition. Most certainly, we would think The witches, the devils, and evil spirits must have been taken out by the new editor and publisher, Georg Scheurer. Even some historical secondary literature suggests that the new edition eliminated the chapters about the mystic influences and magic. This, nonetheless, is not true. Part 13 about sorcery, witches, demons, and works of the devil is well in its place in 1686. Going through the book page by page, I found that the text of the new edition is word for word the same as the 100-year-older one, and even the illustrations are repeats. They are copper engravings redone after the original woodcuts and thus showing in reverse. And only the style of the clothing had been updated in them. The protruding cancerous eye is pictured the same way. The cataract needles look identical. And the image of proto-anesthesia appears very similar to the original. Furthermore, the strange growths in the eye caused by witches and the influence of the signs of the zodiac are also depicted like they were in the first edition of the book. So, was the Augendienst not at all touched by the astonishing advancement of medicine in the 17th century? Did time stand still in its text and illustrations for 103 years? This would be absolutely impossible in case of a medical publication nowadays. In most of its content, the book indeed remained unchanged. And this is an example for the fact that the scientific revolution did not eliminate all earlier trends in science with an abrupt cut. French and English Paracelsians were still actively researching the occult and publishing their master's works in numerous editions. Newton produced an enormous manuscript corpus about alchemy, and surgery seems to have acquired only a little innovation during the 17th century. And it is well known that the influence of astrology on popular culture has been popping up repeatedly in relation to medical topics, not only at that time, but even to this day. But finally, in the concluding part of the 1686 Augendienst, we can notice signs of new times occurring in the book. The very end shows significant changes. The entire last chapter, the 16th part, is missing because the editor considered the content of this pharmacological section out of date, so he left it out. The lack of this old materia medica is a keen reflection of the new developments in medicine introduced by the iatrochemical school, which approached medical phenomena in terms of chemical processes. The new methodology of the iatrochemical school obviously became first manifest in pharmacology, as it dealt with chemical agents, and made Bartisch's 16th century list of mostly herbal and animal-based remedies unacceptable for the new edition. Another important practical amendment in the third edition is the inclusion of a subject index. It certainly makes the book much easier to use. In our computerized world, we are not able to imagine working with a text extending almost 500 pages, which is not possible to keyword search. We also often forget what a tedious work indexing is. word after word, making sure all references fall on the right page. Thinking of that can help us appreciate the new index by Scheurer in the third edition. In a sense, it made the Augendienst practically a modern book. In summary, we can ascertain that many aspects of Georg Bartisch's Augendienst are not revolutionary in the history of ophthalmology. However, some are innovative, and some can stand the test of time. It is notable that Bartisch was the original designer of certain surgical instruments, inventor of surgical procedures, and attempted to give a comprehensive overview of ophthalmic surgery of his era. He may have not succeeded with that entirely, but certainly has written the first systematic handbook on ophthalmology in the German language, and with its illustrations provided glimpses into late 16th century life and culture in the Germanic lands. Furthermore, it is remarkable that this medical text was worthy of a new edition more than 100 years after its inception, proving his author's important role in the field of ophthalmic surgery and showing hints of the new era of modern medicine. Thank you.
Questions? Go ahead.
Please?
Yes.
Does Bartisch say anything about a theory of optics that underlies his practice? Because those ideas can be very interesting.
So the question is whether Bartisch talks about optics in the book. Well, actually, no. No optics, no that part of physics is involved in the book. It's really based on ophthalmic surgeon's practical experience that he had a lot.
Any other questions? Bess, who's on the library staff here, is going to tell you a little housekeeping about the collection we have next door. Bess, do you want to come on up?
Sure.
No more questions allowed?
Wait, no, we're going to have more questions.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
there's other people with questions. I didn't see the hands up.
Yeah, there were some.
Yeah. Questions? You think of other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Bess, and maybe some people think some questions.
Well, thank you, Leela, for such a great talk. And so hopefully now all of you should want to see the actual book itself. And we have 2 copies of the 1583 first edition out for you next door. One of them is from the Becker collection, and one of them is from the Ball collection. We have 9 different rare book collections here at the library from the late 1400s up to the mid-20th century or so. And you are all welcome to come and see them. So please start by seeing our Bartisches tonight, and then you're all welcome to come back.
And thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. Leela apparently made a pretty good living. Was that just from fees for his surgery, or did he make money on his book?
I frankly don't know. There must have been many copies, though, and there must have been a market for it because there were new editions published after the first edition. So I suppose that some of them were sold, and it's a huge book, you will see, and profusely illustrated. So I think he could ask a nice amount for that book. So I would say he got some income from the books as well.
Yeah.
How many books now survive? Do we have any idea how many Bartisch are still?
It's not a very, very scarce book. One example is that here we have 2 copies. And the rare ones are the colored ones. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. The question was how many copies survive of the Bartisch Augendienst. So it's hard to tell because I don't think it's really scarce. There is this central database that you can search for extant copies in publicly accessible libraries, and that probably is about 50 to 100 copies available in those collections.
Yes.
I was really struck by the way in which he talked about the works of the devil as part of understanding what's going on with the eyes. I wonder how God fit into his scheme, and did he talk at all about miracles? Because restoring sight to the blind was a kind of quintessential miracle.
Yes, all through the book there is a lot said about God, and there is a lot said about the right way of living. So the question was whether God is mentioned in the Augendienst, and yes, it is. For successful cures, you always have to use God's help. That's mentioned repeatedly in every case that Bartish writes about. And there are prayer-like parts in the text as well. And as I said, godly, nice living also can support healing of the eye. Yes?
How widely was the book read and who read it?
How widely was the book read and who read it? Well, it's a major issue that it's actually written in German, because, as you know, most books previous to this era were medical books, and generally books were published in Latin, and that defined the certain classes who could read it. So these books were read at universities, they got into major libraries, and were read by selected people. With Bartish not being a university taught person and writing in the German language, I think this book had a much wider audience. For the third edition, actually they changed the format, because sometimes if the book is as big as the first edition, which is a folio size, it doesn't allow people to bring it with them and use it practically. For the third edition, they made the size much smaller, and I think that also helped that more people got to read it and used it for their surgery work.
May?
Does the Bartish book imply an early division of labor in terms of I'm surprised there's no mention about lens correction, which is very old and antedates Bartish by hundreds of years. Does this imply that medically trained folks did the lenses and other things? What does this imply about professional specialization?
So what does the book imply about professional specialization? I think that most of what you read in the Bartish book are determined by his experiences. So since he didn't converse and changed information with the medical elite, he didn't know about those professional developments that medical people had. And so as surgeons were such a different class, these are not mentioned in his book. Yes, Dan?
I think we should be very careful about reading too much into the fact that a second edition comes out so much later. This morning I was doing some reading about Beaufort du Petit, and he published a very important set of letters in 1710 describing cases of people injured in the war and then trying to replicate the cortical injuries in dogs. 70 years later, that book was republished, 70 years later. And the reason for that is that one of the French societies under royal patronage was ordered to do so. It had nothing to do with the market demand. So my point is there could be many reasons to see a publication come out again at a later time. It could be the societies that these people belong to are various connections that they might have had. It perhaps could be the demand or just the beauty of the illustrations. But I would say the big mystery to me is what went behind that third printing.
Well, I think this is a little bit different from the case that you mentioned with the French publication. And that is, I am sure about that because the publisher has a very nice introduction in the third edition where he actually explains why he published it. He was not forced. He didn't belong to societies. He was basically a printer-publisher in the 17th century.
So strictly the profit motive?
Some profit motive and some true amazement at the comprehensiveness of Bartysz's work. So he explained that this is such an important book in the history of ophthalmic surgery that he thinks that even though it needs some changes, he wanted to publish it. He's very proud of his subject index because he thought it was impossible to find anything in the first edition without that. And he was right. I tried. And he's really not, or at least I didn't find any other forcing reason why he published the third one.
Mr. Brown, do you have a question?
Well, it's kind of odd that I'm thinking of this as a standard that's kind of been set, and it sounds like the elite didn't necessarily, the information wasn't fluid across the board, but I'm thinking about this lack of sedation. Even if they tie you down, you're going to move your eyes around. This sounds like a pretty tough way to have surgery.
Yes.
For a standard operation.
Yes, definitely. But see, that's why there is a third person involved. Holding that head.
Wow.
And there may have been more than three. Yeah. Yes.
Surgeon Liston was a great surgeon in one description because he was enormous. I think he was 6'4", 6'5", and he had the ability to actually hold his patient down vigorously while he amputated.
On that, I asked my wife to come up here and we're going to on behalf of the Department of Ophthalmology, my wife and I, we want to thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Giving this wonderful lecture. And again, we'll give you okay, a couple of housekeeping things.